Hello, my name is Riley Donahoe, and I'm doing my presentation on the United States and the global war on terrorism. So, the global war on terror really started after the 9/11, September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. There were terrorist attacks before that time, like the 1998 attempted bombing of the World Trade Center that was organized by Al Qaeda. But 9/11 was kind of the titular point of the beginning of the global war on terrorism. So 19 Al Qaeda terrorists hijacked four commercial planes, and two of them struck the World Trade Centers in New York City. One of them struck the Pentagon, and another crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Approximately 2,977 lives were lost during the attacks. Many more people were injured, and many people to this day suffer from issues that occurred because of those attacks. Shortly after the attacks, President George W. Bush at the time announced a plan to seek out the perpetrators of the attacks. Um, they had some good intelligence that they already knew who did it, mainly Osama bin Laden, who was the leader of Al Qaeda, and he was also the planner of the 1998 bombing of the World Trade Centers. So on October 10th, 2001 is when the U.S. started conducting military operations in Afghanistan, and that can kind of be looked at as the official starting point to the global war on terror. So in 2003, the United States invaded the country of Iraq under the pretense that the dictator at the time, Saddam Hussein, his regime had weapons of mass destruction, and they were also sympathetic to terrorists like Al Qaeda, and that they posed a security risk to the United States. So we invaded the country uh, under an authorization that Congress gave George W. Bush to invade Afghanistan and combat terrorism. And our main goal was to seek out these weapons of mass destruction while also overthrowing Saddam Hussein's regime and promoting democracy in the country. Saddam Hussein was overthrown and captured in December of 2003. He was held in a prison, and he was eventually executed in 2006 after a trial held by his own government. After the U.S. conquered Iraq and captured Baghdad and many of the cities and ousted Hussein's government, an insurgency quickly arose in which it was led by Al Qaeda and some other Islamic terrorist groups. And so the U.S., what they thought was going to be a fairly quick war, it ended up being a more lengthy war once the insurgency took hold. So combat operations officially ended in Iraq in 2011, but the United States still keeps a small contingency of support troops in the country, and I believe it's around 2,500 troops still remain in the country today. So after the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, George W. Bush had to act quickly, and so he received authorization from Congress to use military force against any country that was harboring terrorists that were responsible for the attacks, and any countries or entities that supported terrorism. So based off of intelligence that we had at the time, we pinpointed the attacks to Al Qaeda, and more specifically to Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al Qaeda at the time. So the Bush administration issued an ultimatum to the Taliban government in Afghanistan, and basically this ultimatum stated that the Taliban needed to close every terrorist training camp in the country, hand over Osama bin Laden, hand over any terrorists and their supporters, and give the U.S. access to inspect any terrorist training facilities in the country so we could verify that they had indeed been shut down. The Taliban was actually conflicted over this ultimatum, and some people wanted to abide by it and hand over Osama bin Laden, but ultimately the decision was made to deny this ultimatum, at which point the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom in October of 2001. This included a big air campaign in which we bombed a lot of the terrorist training facilities, Al Qaeda terrorist training facilities that we knew of. Um, Also, coalition forces went in and basically ousted the Taliban government out of all the urban areas and cities. They had to flee to basically the more rural areas of Afghanistan in the mountains, and also to neighboring Pakistan, right across the border in the mountainous regions. Al Qaeda and the Taliban fled and hid up there. So once we basically ousted the Taliban government, the United Nations and the U.S. coalition forces received authorization to establish an international security assistance force, and their main job was basically to maintain security around Kabul, and make sure that the new democratic government that was coming to power basically just maintained security and make sure they were able to be successful and do what they needed to do. So after the Taliban fled the major cities, there was a lot of guerrilla warfare fighting in the country. Um, the vast majority of the country is rural, so it was really hard to fight the Taliban. It was an unconventional war. The United States, during its time in Afghanistan, they initiated numerous offensives against the Taliban to basically try to crush them once and for all. And it seemed like every offensive that they launched, the Taliban just kept coming back and kept coming back, or they would attack them and then they would flee into Pakistan, in which U.S. forces were not really authorized to go, since Pakistan was one of our allies. So ultimately, the war in Afghanistan ended in August 30th, 2021, when the last U.S. troops and allied troops withdrew from Afghanistan after negotiations with the Taliban for a peace deal, and the Taliban once again hold power in Afghanistan and are running the country. So Osama bin Laden, who was the leader and founder of Al Qaeda, which was operating out of Afghanistan, basically after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and their campaign against the Taliban and Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden was forced to hide out in the mountains of Afghanistan. The U.S. received some intelligence where they thought they knew where Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan, and so U.S. forces went looking for him, and basically they pushed him out of the country. They never found him. But it wasn't until around 2011 that the U.S. received some new intel that they thought that he might be hiding out in Pakistan, at which point a raid was launched on May 2nd, 2011, conducted by U.S. Navy SEALs along with the CIA on a compound in Pakistan, in which Osama bin Laden was killed by U.S. forces. So some other countries that were involved in the global war on terrorism were Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan. In 2014, the Obama administration launched Operation Inherent Resolve in Iraq and Syria, and that was because of the rise of the ISIS caliphate in those countries. Basically, ISIS was this new Islamic caliphate that took over both Iraq and Syria. They're basically like the new Al Qaeda, even though Al Qaeda still existed. So military operations were launched in 2014 against them, in which actual military troops and operations were carried out in Syria, which the U.S. was not in. Our military was not in Syria before. Also, military strikes were conducted in Yemen against Al Qaeda members. And in Pakistan, the U.S. has conducted strikes on the Taliban and Al Qaeda, mainly using drones, but there were times in which troops were involved in Pakistan.